Well, thank you, Professor Wescoat, for that sort of extremely thoughtful presentation. We have time for a quick round of questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll just do sort of like one set of questions before we move on.
Hello. Thanks a lot for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering, this idea about gardens and similarity between gardens and the Indus Basin, how closely related is that to 2 points? One would be, I guess, the identity of the Mughals, because that's where, if I understand correctly, the argument starts about thinking of the Indus as a garden. And secondly, to what extent is that derived from marginal environments? So you mentioned Baltistan as one of the. You mentioned Baltistan as one of the areas where you looked at gardens, and the rulers of Baltistan also came from Central Asia. Maybe there's like a link there. So to what extent does that seep into folklore or folk tales, and how does the population understand the river itself or imagines or conceives of as a garden? Is that through the rulers, or is it because of the marginal environment that they have to think of it as a network, linked to like a main river, and how that feeds into gardens? I guess these are the 2 factors.
Thank you, Dr. Wescoat, for absolutely wonderful presentation. I just want to if you could comment on the relative importance of subsoil water resources versus surface water resources in Mughal artwork. My own personal research looks at the marginalization of groundwater governance in the Indus Basin, and I'm wondering if there's like a historical path dependence in the way groundwater is managed during pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial current period, and whether that's connected to how it was represented and discussed and given importance for the time period that you studied. Thank you.
As always, Jenny, you made me somewhat emotional with your presentation. I'd like to invite you to scale down a little bit, because at the moment I'm working on this project on cultural politics of urban gardening, believe it or not. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit upon urban areas as gardens, particularly when one is talking about personal gardens or public gardening, and what are the sorts of prospects there, or have you sort of thought about it? Just some thoughts I'd like to know. The second question I have is, if you could reflect a little bit about that idea of values and politics, and how development, if you will, is understood in the southern context or in Pakistan context. What are the sorts of values that suggest themselves which converge or diverge from the present developmental ethos as you see them in, say, Pakistan or anywhere else? So.
Okay, these are great questions and challenging ones to address. Let me start, Brenton, with your question of the association with the identity with the Mughal culture and with other Central Asian cultures, and say that this is a very significant, call it macro regional transfer of some ideas. But there were 2 points that have been made in research on Mughal gardens that helped to balance that. The one was an essay by Anthony Wells called "The Gardens That Babur Didn't Like," and in there was there's a historical archaeological evidence for local gardening traditions that were also concurrent and active and indeed influential for Mughal gardens that they didn't acknowledge. So this is to balance out the sense of it being an imported cultural tradition and a local one. And related to that also is the ways in which moguls themselves realized how much adaptation was required to realize a new type of gardens in the plains environment. And they were very explicit and conscious about doing that, and having some dissatisfaction at first, but subsequently being more proud of those places and hearkening back only with nostalgia to Central Asia. On the subsurface and surface tradition, I think this is where this macro-historical perspective can be very useful. So if we think of well irrigation as the dominant form of water use in the pre-colonial period, and there being a recognition of very high yields associated with well irrigation. So the well irrigation, because it was so labor-intensive, animals and human, was being delivered to small cultivated areas that were highly productive and recognized as such. What they didn't have was scale. And so the canal irrigation is bringing in a much larger scale of water application, development, and production. But maybe now in a shift back to conjunctive water management, jointly groundwater and surface water, one can recall all of those benefits associated with it's not just a constraints of surface water irrigation that lead to an increase in groundwater development, but also the type of precision application, demand-based irrigation possible through well irrigation when it's well managed. You can get higher yields. And so the ways in which these two systems are related to one another for many, many years that call for conjunctive water management. But I like to think maybe if it's a single system, seen as a single system, and to be managed as such, the benefits of both systems can be realized jointly, and in very inspired ways where some of that precision irrigation, whether it's from the canal source or the groundwater source, is going to be the basis for realizing closing yield gaps in part, but also of achieving the kind of quality of production that one aspires to. That said, the challenges of groundwater primarily, I think, those associated with quality. What are the new technologies for reducing the TDS and salinity? And we're already seeing attempts at much less expensive electrodialysis, shock electrodialysis technologies that are substituting in for reverse osmosis and so on. If that can happen, then we'll see this groundwater, surface water nexus, if well managed, and the regulatory component. Without regulations, it's going to be tough. Maharashtra State, where we're working in India, has a beautiful groundwater act. On paper, it looks great. Every single water engineer I've spoken to said, how are we going to implement that? How are we actually going to enforce these groundwater regulations that in practice? Well, I think they're going to discover ways. There'll be remote sensing techniques. There'll be all kinds of other sensing techniques. We've talked about designing pumps that have an automatic shut-off or just a reader to tell you when you're over your quotient. And these are starting to become cost efficient. The scaling down, Donna just asked about the urban, and I think that's a great question, because in part, if you think of gardens in terms of economic geography, there are places that are associated with cities. The Tunin model will put the horticultural belt right around the edges of a city. So what we're seeing is a blurring of urban agricultural boundaries. And when it's unplanned, it's chaotic and wasteful. If planned and well designed, you can start to see cases where peri-urban development is attractive, and where the urban fringe is one that has many of the amenities of urban life, but in a rural type of setting that can make it. Now, it's in terms of, again, the implementation of policies and our envisioning forms of metropolitan regional development that will make this possible. I think that's a frontier and a great field for research, so I hope a lot of people are joining the research project on that. Values and politics, the last question in relationship to development. Just as we can rethink the idea of gardens as being something that's of an almost unlimited spatial scale and scope, one can think about development, I think, in different terms as well. You think about development in the form of human development, what it means to develop as a person, what it means to develop as a community, what it means to develop. These are subject to radical redefinition. And so rather than, I wouldn't argue for throwing out the concept of development, I'd argue for a radical redefinition of it in ways that would inspire us with the values that we do hold in common. I think the point to be made from the presentation, we see these values all through the landscape. They're everywhere with so many different millions of people that one just needs to draw them together with new accounts that are persuasive for others and for society and as a whole. Those are just some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That sort of draws this part of the session to close, and I think Abu Bakr will sort of lead us into the next.